It's the Happy Families podcast. It's the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now.
This is the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now. Today it's all about reading and your kids, whether they're little kids who are just sounding out their first words or big kids who have decided that the telephone and screen is more exciting than anything they can read in a book. Today it's a podcast that you want to hear because reading is so foundational for every success that our kids have in life. I say this all the time on the podcast. Readers are leaders and leaders are readers. My guest on the podcast today is the Australian Children's Laureate. If you're not sure what a laureate is, and if you didn't know that Australia had a children's laureate, we'll talk about that in a sec. But please, may I introduce you to Sally Rippin. Sally is the 8th Australian Children's Laureate. She is Australia's highest selling female author with, wait for it, over 10 million. That's million. 10 million books in print around the globe, more than 100 books for children and young people to her name, including the wildly popular Billy B. Brown and Hey Jack series, as well as School of Monsters and Polly and Buster. Sally writes stories with heart and characters that resonate with children, parents and teachers alike. And Sally, we're here to talk about reading. So glad that you're with me on the Happy Families podcast. Thank you for chatting.
Thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be here too, Justin.
Let's talk about what a laureate is, because this is a fancy word that most of us don't use every day.
It's true. So laureates exist all around the world. The Australian Children's Laureate has only been around probably for about 16 years, I think. Our first ones were Alison Lester and Burry Monty Pryor. And basically, we are chosen by our peers and a board and a committee. And what a laureate does is represent the body of children's authors and illustrators in Australia. So say, for example, Justin, you want to know something about kids' books. You think, okay, I'll call the laureate and I'm here for you.
That's so good of you. So a children's laureate means that you're focused primarily on getting books into kids' hands. You're interested in helping authors to write books that kids want to read. You're interested in helping teachers and parents to get those books read by the kids. Can we just take a step back and talk a bit about the research? Why, for people who don't really think that reading's a big deal, maybe don't have too many books on the shelf and are pretty happy for the kids to, get outside and play or stare at their screen, why do we need to emphasize and elevate reading?
Well, as you said in your introduction, Justin, is that everything requires reading. So the reason why I'm particularly passionate about this and my mission is all kids can be readers is because there will always be children who fall through the gap. And this was the case with my youngest son. I learned to read before I started school. My two older boys were the same, but my youngest son plateaued in grade 3 and we had him assessed and he's dyslexic. So this was about, must be 12 years ago. And that's when I started to write the Billy B. Brown and Hey Jack series for kids who struggle to read. But I've since learned that there are many more things that we can do to support kids that struggle to read, because the first 3 years really, we're focused on kids learning to read. And after grade 3, we're expecting them to read to learn. So if they miss those really vital years, they'll always be playing catch up. And as I found with my son, once he started high school, it wasn't just about engaging fantastic stories, which is, of course, important as it is. But every subject requires reading. The way you express yourself, the way you can show what you've learned and all the knowledge that you store, it's all through language and literacy. So his self-esteem plummeted, his mental health really went down. And I recognized how important reading is, not just for engaging great books, but for everything we do in life.
Sally, I love the emphasis on everyone being a reader that you've highlighted. You've mentioned your son's dyslexia. There are plenty of parents who listen to this podcast whose kids are neurodivergent, ADHD, autism. And what we again find is when competence is low, when kids are struggling with something, they tend to be less motivated to do it. They just don't want to be there. You couple that with the reality that there are some pretty enticing alternative activities outside of books, and it makes for a really complicated and challenging scenario for parents who desperately want that 8-year-old ADHD kid or that 6-year-old dyslexic kid or just that wonderful child who won't pick up a book. What do we do to get books into their hands and help them to find? I mean, I'm a reader. I read probably 40 to 50 books a year. For me, this is a thing, right? I just care so much about it, and I know what books just open up worlds. What do we do to get these kids that are just saying, no, not for me, not competent, doesn't feel good? How do we get them reading?
So there's a few things. I'm not sure if you saw a few weeks ago, Justin, the Grattan report came out and identified that a third of our children are getting through primary school without having required reading skills to really perform well in life. So those are just really basic skills, not even just being able to enjoy good stories. And we know reading stories, other people's stories, are important for developing empathy. They develop your vocabulary. They help you make connections with stories and how other people might live in the world. And so, of course, we want our children to be readers. And so we really need to get intervention and identification happening really early on. So pretty much as soon as a child starts school, if a teacher, as you say, has identified there might be some neurological differences there. My son later was identified as also having ADHD, and so obviously had some challenges reading, not just through dyslexia, but also paying attention. And so those kids are just going to need some extra support. And we want to build a team around these kids with the teachers, potentially with support outside of the school. But always there will be kids who just find reading a real struggle. And that's where I would say, don't be snobby about what they read. I really, really was, because like you, I was a reader. I wanted my child to read Charlotte's Web and love it like I had. I read it aloud to him, Justin. And this is just gives you an example of his focus. At the end of the book, when I was crying, I was like, oh, and Charlotte died. And he turned to me and he said, who's Charlotte again?
Oh, no.
All right. This is a kid that hasn't engaged with stories in the same way as me. So look for other things. Your child likes cooking, read cookbooks with them. Your child loves cars, read car manuals with them. Graphic novels, comics are fantastic ways to get kids to engage with stories. And my son, who's now 20, reads subtitles on anime, on movies. So, he has found a reason to really want to build up his reading skills because he's found something that he can connect with.
This is a real bugbear of mine, like subtitles. Just drives me crazy. And yet I have to pause and think, no, they are reading. I know that they're reading and listening, but they're reading. And just recently I was watching a show that was in Spanish and I'm learning Spanish. And while I'm learning Spanish and watching this show, I'm thinking, oh my goodness, all of it's starting to click. And I suddenly had this new appreciation for subtitles. You said don't be a reading snob. And for me, this has been a big thing because I care so much about great literature and great books and great learning. Our youngest, really, we just couldn't get her reading. Could not get her to pick up a book no matter what. And I'm talking about all the best ones that I've sat and, like Bridge to Terabithia, I've sat there and cried with my older kids as I've read it to them, and The Princess Bride and Narnia, all these classics, and she just wouldn't touch anything. And then one day we found her. She'd borrowed a book from the library. It was a graphic novel, like literally a comic book about dragons, Wings of Fire. I'm sure you know the Wings of Fire books. Mm-hmm. And I rolled my eyes. I looked down my nose, so much disdain. I'm like, oh my goodness, I've got a 7-year-old girl reading a comic book about dragons, and I don't really like the tone of the book. There's a lot that I don't like about it. And then I paused and thought, oh no, this is my opportunity to practice what I preach. And so I took a deep breath and I said, do you like it? And she said, yes. And I said, would you like to get the next one when you finish that? And she looked at me, Sally, with the widest eyes and just said, really? So I said, yeah. And in the end, I think we probably have 20 or 25 Wings of Fire books on our bookshelf now. But the Wings of Fire led to, she wanted to watch Harry Potter, and we said, well, read the book first. She's now read 4 or 5 of the Harry Potter books, which also led to her wanting to watch Percy Jackson. And we've said, well, before you watch it, read the book. So now she's reading book 4 or book 5 of Percy Jackson. And this kid who 3 or 4 years ago would not pick up a book is reading fantastic stuff. She's like, I can't get her to turn off the light and go to bed at night. She won't stop reading. The idea that you shared around just getting them into books, and the other thing that you said about being involved, reading with them, these things just resonate so much.
So important. And also she gets to see her parents reading, which is exactly what you're doing. And I'm always saying to dads, if you want to get your boys reading, let them see you reading. If we're sending them off into their room to read their school reader, that feels like a punishment. Let reading be a joyous thing that the family does. Read with your child. And audiobooks, amazing. So there will always be kids who struggle to read. They may be dyslexic, they may be vision impaired, but you can access all of these wonderful stories through audiobooks. So another thing I really want to champion is not only do we want to allow kids to choose their own reading material and how they access stories, but let's not be a snob about it. I think it's really important. If I was to joke with you, Justin, about how bad I am at maths, you wouldn't judge my intelligence. But if I tell you that I'm bad at reading or writing, straight away people make assumptions about our intelligence. So another thing I'm really passionate about doing as the Children's Laureate as I travel the country is to remember that there will be kids that will always struggle to read and ensure that they find other ways to access stories, whether it's through audiobooks, whether it's through oral storytelling or reading aloud to them. Don't really write them off so quickly because stories are available to everybody in many different formats.
Sally Rippin is the 8th Australian Children's Laureate, the highest selling female author Australia has ever produced. And Sally is on a mission to help everyone know that all kids can be readers. This is going to sound like a strange thing to say, Sally, but based on what you've just mentioned, this idea that if our kids are falling behind, like there's that issue around if you don't read well, people actually assess your intelligence differently versus if you don't maths well. Everyone laughs. Maths, yeah, whatever. But reading is a big deal. I'm presently writing a book about bringing up boys, and I'm writing some education chapters. At every level, it seems that our boys are lagging girls when it comes to academic outcomes. They're lagging in terms of year 12 completion. They're lagging in terms of going to university. They're absolutely lagging in terms of graduating from university. And this matters in a couple of really important ways. First of all, we know that the better you do educationally, the more likely it is that you're going to earn more. So you'll be financially more stable. But something else that I was really fascinated by as I was doing this research is, and this is a sort of a thorny place to go, but I want to go there anyway because the data really points here. There's a dating and mating problem that's associated with education. So studies show that while men are happy to date and marry at an education and an economic level that's either up, down, or level with their own accomplishments, women feel differently. And data points to women marrying at either the same level educationally and economically or up. So women are less likely to date and marry at the same level or down. They seem to go up, which means that with fewer men achieving or exceeding the same status that women attain when it comes to education and economic outcomes, the dating and mating pool is an increasingly challenging place for both men and women. When I look at stats like that, I think this conversation becomes even more important because from a statistical perspective, our boys don't read like girls read, and therefore our boys aren't having the same educational outcomes. This is not just about doing well at school. This is something that affects our entire lives, our companionships, our relationships, our finances, obviously, but the way that we interact with people throughout the rest of our lives. I wonder if you have any comments on that.
Absolutely. And I think if you even look at the education environment, starting from when kids are very young, and you may be covering this in your book, but it's very female dominated. Most primary school teachers are female. Usually the person who interacts with your child's teacher is the mother. And often it's mothers that are taking kids to bookstores to buy books and reading with them. So little boys are growing up thinking not only is reading not a masculine thing to do, but even education is very female dominated. Studies also show that boys can often develop behind girls as well. And so they're often going to feel on the back foot. So they're in an environment where they're told to be very quiet, to sit very still. And we know also their developmental motor skills can be behind girls. So even sitting at a desk and writing can be too much to ask of an active young boy. So we really do need to look at how our schools can be more boy-friendly in a way, but also the way that we judge accomplishments and achievements. I really had to reassess that with my youngest son, because while he was when he was in year 10, he was teaching himself university level calculus. But because he couldn't write an essay on Shakespeare, he wasn't able to pass school. So even the fact that we only judge intelligence in a particular way will always put boys on the back foot. And I think we really need to break down these stereotypes of how we measure intelligence, what intelligence looks like, and the opportunities available for neurodivergent people once they leave school.
This is really fascinating. One more question on this. How do we help boys to love reading? Like how do we make reading more masculine? Because reading doesn't feel like kicking a footy. It's not as tactile. It does require sitting still and concentrating and staring at words on a page. I mean, I don't see reading as being feminine or masculine. It's just something that I love to do. But I guess the question on my mind based on this tangent of a conversation is how do we get the boys especially into books so that they're more likely to have these positive outcomes?
I think the number one thing is for them to see men reading. And I think not just their dads, but let's have a whole campaign where we're seeing footballers read and we're seeing all kinds of sports stars reading, so that boys see it's a really cool masculine thing to do. And many of my friends who are children's authors are often thinking of boys as they're writing their books. And so, let boys choose the kind of books they're interested in. It may not be Charlotte's Web, it might be something else, but really engage them with the material that they're drawn to, rather than wanting them to be more like we think they should be. Let's listen to them a little bit more and see what they're interested in and connect with them that way.
Let me ask you an incendiary question here, something that could be explosive. There's a really big push in publishing at the moment to increase diversity and to reduce the number of male characters and reduce the number of just male protagonism is at the very core of what has been writing for such a very long time. Is that a good or a bad thing, especially when we're looking at the issue that boys are struggling to get into books? Do they need more, not less, of their own representation?
I think this is a problem that you identified that certainly was being identified when I first started writing about 20 years ago. And we kind of swung in that direction of really putting so many strong boy characters in books. And apparently the rumor goes that the reason why J.K. Rowling didn't call herself by her full name and used her initials is so boys wouldn't see that it was a girl who'd written the book. And so I think we also need to break down stereotypes of what we think boys are and what they're attracted to. And so I also, once I'd written the Billy B. Brown series about a strong female character, I wanted to create a series for sensitive boys. I know my 3 boys, as they were growing up, were very sensitive and have big feelings that they didn't know how to express. So all of the stories that I wrote about Jack were about him expressing his feelings and his emotions and recognizing that these aren't girly things to do, that these are actually important life skills that you'll need when, like you say, when you're meeting partners. I'm sure they'll be so much more impressed that you can have emotional intelligence rather than the books you read. I mean, obviously books are really, really important. That's often how we gain emotional intelligence. But rather than belittling the materials that we give our boys, there's this assumption that they'll only want to read action books or that they'll only want to read comedy. These are important things. But I know with my little boys, often rather than talking about their emotions, they'd make a joke to laugh it off. And I think let's really not undermine how we want our boys to express themselves and help them to talk about their emotions. And books are a great way to do this. Let them see their dads read and their dads ask them questions about how did that story make you feel, not just what happened in that book.
Sally, as we wrap this up, if there was a take-home message, if there was one thing that you wanted parents to walk away from the podcast and say, okay, this is what I need to do today, this is what the focus needs to be this week, what do you want people to really carry home from this conversation?
I think the number one thing is to, if your child is very young, then to really look at how they may just need that extra intervention. If they're not hitting those milestones, get in quickly. If they've missed that gap, then make sure that they can still access great stories. Let them see you reading, put on audiobooks in the car, and make sure reading and books and storytelling is a joyous activity.
Sally Rippin, the 8th Australian Children's Laureate and the author of a bunch of books that I have on my bookshelf because my kids loved the Billy B. Brown series. 10 million books. Can I ask you a quick personal question? How does it feel to know that you've sold more books than any other female author in this country? I mean, that must be amazing.
It's such a thrill, Justin, but I think it's more the fact that when I go into shopping centres to do book signings or schools, kids know my work. And sometimes this can even happen with older kids. I remember doing a book signing in a shopping centre and a group of teenage girls walked past and they saw me signing some Billy books for some little girls and they called out, "Oh, I remember those books. I used to read them when I was little." And I think if I can be at the start of a child's reading journey, like you were explaining your daughter had to go through this journey to read more sophisticated books, I think that is a true honour, that if I can turn kids onto reading, then that's the biggest thrill of all.
Thanks so much for the conversation, Sally.
Pleasure. Good to meet you.
The Happy Families podcast is produced by Justin Rowland from Bridge Media. Craig Bruce is our executive producer. For more information about making your family happier, visit happyfamilies.com.au. And if you'd like to know more about Sally, we will link to a bunch of her books and series in the show notes and give you some more information about the Australian Children's Laureate.